Had the American Revolution not happened, we would know George Washington most likely for starting a world war.
Welcome to Echoes of History, Alexis. It's fantastic to have you here.
I'm so pleased to be here.
I can't wait to find out more about George Washington. It's a name everybody knows, but I probably don't really know as much about him as I should. So I'm really, really keen to find out more. I wonder if you could give us, maybe this is an impossible question and a mean one to start you off on. If you were writing George Washington's CV and you've got to give 3 bullet points for what he would want people to know about him, how would you describe George Washington?
I love that question. And I actually, when I was writing You Never Forget Your First from about 2016 to 2019, I wrote exactly that. I listed all his titles on a CV because I wanted my biography to be for 2 types of people, which is sort of everyone. I wanted the people who thought they knew him to be reintroduced to him in a different way. And then I also wanted people who didn't know him that well to be able to move forward with confidence and all the information that they would have if they had been well versed in all the George Washington biographies. I would say that we have to start with the title he had the longest, which was Master. George Washington became the owner of enslaved people when he was just a boy. When he was 10 years old, he inherited 11 enslaved people. His next title that I would give you was, of course, General. We can't deny him, the hero of the Revolution. He invented so many precedents for the presidency. He was trusted more than any man, I think, ever in America, because he gave up power after the Revolution and voluntarily left after 2 terms, a precedent that was respected and followed for almost 250 years. And of course, president. That would be the last one. And I think he would like 2 out of 3 of those and would understand that the 3rd one didn't age well.
What kind of sources do we have for Washington's early life? So as someone who wasn't maybe born into the massively prominent role that he will end up in, how much do we know about young Washington?
We know a good deal for a few different reasons. He had to drop out of school and become a surveyor at a young age because his father died. And so as a boy, when he inherited enslaved people, he also became the de facto head of his household, even though he had a mother. And she tried very hard to advocate for her family in the courts, even when she wasn't really supposed to be there or speak up. He was communicating with people about business, about opportunities. He wanted to be the center of his country's story. And for a long time, he really didn't have a preference about which country that was. He would have happily served the crown, which leads me to the next thing we know about him. Had the American Revolution not happened, we would know George Washington most likely for starting a world war. He, of course, led the Virginia militia and started the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War. But it falls in the long shadow of the Revolution, so here in America, we don't call it anything much very often.
And how reliable are some of the sources that we have for this early period of his life? Because there's always a danger with people like Washington that his later reputation will cause people to go back and try and sort of mold his younger years, almost to suggest that he was always destined to be this great man. Do we have to be careful with some of the sources that we have for his earlier life?
We have to be careful always of the word destiny. I hate it. I hate it because it denies people the real work that they did, and also it makes them inaccessible and almost superhuman, which is not at all any person I've ever met. And certainly as a presidential historian, I've never studied a perfect president or a perfect person. What's interesting about your question is that George Washington himself tried to present himself in a better light. So after he left Philadelphia, where the second president's residence was, he ended up carting all his papers back and editing them. But he edited the wrong things, of course, because we can't predict how things will age. And so he left a lot of things in there that do not look good. His relations with Indians, his lack of evolution, I would say, when it comes to slavery. And so that's also a really interesting point. One of my favorite primary sources is a letter that young George Washington wrote to the last royal governor of Virginia, Dinwiddie. And he wrote to him complaining about his pay and how, he's worked so hard, but he'll never be equal to a British born subject, someone who wasn't born in America. And that really bothered him. And then on page 6 or 7, he's like, oh, by the way, there was a diplomatic incident and I might have assisted in the murder of a French diplomat. And that's how the French and Indian War started.
Wow, so you're just going to slip that in the middle of a letter?
Yes.
My life's awful. I wish I'd been born English. It's so unfair. By the way, I killed someone.
Right, but not only that, I killed a diplomat, and that's going to start a world war. And so I feel like people can edit themselves, and I think that's easier today. I would never, ever want to be studied the way I study people. Just absolutely awful. But George Washington really didn't understand how we would view him. Or, another way of saying that is he did what he could and then left the rest up to future generations.
Is the French-Indian War then, is that the moment when George Washington begins to emerge as a military figure? So up until this point, we've had a surveyor who's lost his father quite young. He's been taking on sort of business matters for the family. How does that transform into becoming a soldier who presumably will rise up through the ranks?
It was one of the only ways to get ahead in early America. He was the third son of this, and the first son of the second marriage. So he really wasn't getting anything in terms of money or prestige. He was after it, though, constantly. I always say that if there was a single young woman of some means in early America, George Washington probably hit on her as a teen. And that didn't quite work out, but the Virginia militia did. He was, however, well-positioned in some ways. His half-brothers had married well, but Washington also was a gifted athlete. My male colleagues will focus on his thighs and other parts of his body to explain something that I think is quite simple, which is he was a wonderful athlete. He was really graceful. Thomas Jefferson describes him riding a horse and says, he was the best I've ever seen. So was his mother. And so I think he was inclined in this way to be a good soldier, although later we'll see that he wasn't the greatest strategist. So when he worked for the Virginia militia, he's obviously just taking orders. He's taking orders from, Governor Dinwiddie. He's taking orders from Parliament. He's not making any decisions. And when he does, it's absolutely disastrous. Later, he's in charge of more strategy. He relies on a council of war, and he'll later try to reinvent that through the cabinet, the invention of the cabinet. But in general, he is very good at taking some direction when he's a young man, and later not quite as good. And then he doesn't know how to translate that when he becomes president. He invents the cabinet because he wants a diversity of opinions, but he assumes that once he makes a decision, it's all over. And of course, that doesn't happen at all. So he enters office without claiming any sort of political party. He remains our only president to do so, but he was very, very obviously a Federalist. And we know this because he sided with Alexander Hamilton almost all the time. And that didn't totally make sense to me until I found this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And he described some of those cabinet meetings as cockfights. And then I watched a cockfight on YouTube and very much regretted it because it's a bloodbath. It's not a political argument that we, at least in America, are used to seeing. I think that they almost came to blows, and that fight didn't end once Washington said, okay, thanks so much for your opinions. I'm going to make this decision. It spilled out into the street, and it gave rise to partisan newspapers in which people would write these anonymous essays. They would write under pseudonyms. My favorite is Porcupine. And Washington was incensed, but he didn't believe that it was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe until he really couldn't deny it any longer. And then he never spoke to them again.
I like the idea that he's kind of inventing this system of cabinet government to deal with his own weaknesses. And he's like, I want to hear all of your opinions as soon as I've told you what your opinions are. Right. I want to hear them repeated back to me.
Exactly. He's asking for their opinions, but he kind of knows what he wants to do anyway. And the cabinet is so interesting because, of course, the Americans all blamed Parliament for the coercive acts, for so many of the frustrating, shall we say, elements that led up to the American Revolution, which was a strange disconnect because the king agreed with Parliament, for one, which they found out after the First Continental Congress in 1774, where they write, our dear father, our beloved father, a letter, and they say, like, we you must not know about this, but these terrible things have been going on. So surely you're going to intervene, and we're your loyal subjects. So much can change, in a matter of I think it was 7 months. And now we're just on the 250th anniversary of the First Continental Congress. But he blamed Parliament. And there were still those really lingering negative feelings about Parliament. And so in the Constitution, it very clearly said, like, nothing like that. But you can write to the heads of each of your department. And so that's how Washington started out. He would write to the heads of each of his departments. But then it would take forever for them to respond. And he'd get one letter, he'd have questions, he'd write it to the next guy. It was like incredibly inefficient. And so he started summoning them to his house, not for a ton of meetings, but for enough that, Hamilton and Jefferson became mortal enemies.
Yeah, is that something Hamilton the musical gets a bit right then? The cabinet meetings that end up in a rap battle kind of fight and everyone kicking each other.
They do. I mean, there's a lot that Hamilton gets right and a lot that Hamilton gets wrong. I don't think it's Lin-Manuel Miranda's fault necessarily. I think it's more Ron Chernow's fault, which the musical is based on. But I think it's really wonderful. And ironically, one of my favorite characters is King George. I love those songs, even though I don't think that's quite accurate. But they're wonderful.
Yeah, no, I love Hamilton. So it's my guilty pleasure for American history. So Washington then is beginning his career around this French-Indian War. What time period are we in here? What years is this happening? And how old is Washington when he's beginning this military career?
He's in his 20s, and he rises quickly. He comes from some means, and of course you're buying commissions, and he has some connections through his half-brother. But he is in his 20s, we're talking about the 1750s, and he is doing okay, but he's suffering not only from a lack of humility and from what he feels like is a lack of meritocracy. And it was, but at the same time, the irony, as famously a man in Parliament said, that, these guys are complaining about us because Washington enslaved people. But he's not doing so well. What's amazing about Washington's body and this gracefulness, this amazing physical prowess, is that he was almost always sick. And one of the ways that he became ill during when he was the leader of the Virginia militia was he got dysentery, and he had to ride around on a pillow. It wasn't the most comfortable. He actually went to see Dinwiddie and see a doctor in Richmond, Virginia, and that's when he heard, pray tell, of Martha Custis, her very sad loss that she had just become a widow. And wouldn't you know it, there were no more male heirs except for her 4-year-old son. And he was like, well, I think I found my promotion. I know how I'm going to retire from the British militia. And that's what he did.
The man with a plan. So it sounds like in his younger years, then in that early career, you say he's lacking humility, which might feel a little bit at odds with what we think of later Washington and the ways that he will behave later in his career. Do you think that's something about him that changed, or did he always lack that humility?
I think he lacked some humility, but I think probably a better way to describe it is he had a hard time controlling his temper. He got very frustrated. It came out rarely when he was older, but when it did, it was noted. That's the wonderful thing about the founders. They were so gossipy. And so they're going to write a letter about this. They're going to, talk about it. And it's not quite like Pinocchio's nose. These stories don't actually get worse over time. If anything, they get a little bit better, a little bit kinder. When Washington was younger, he was really frustrated. He felt shortchanged almost immediately because in many ways, in his opinion, he was. His half-brothers went to the Appleby School in London, but by the time he was ready to go, his father had died, they had no money, he had to drop out of school. He felt really inadequate compared to so many. And if you look at the founders, they went to Harvard, they went to William and Mary, they went to schools. And so Washington is not doing that. However, I will argue he's an autodidact. He was always trying to fill in those holes. When he left Philadelphia after the First Continental Congress, and they're like, oh, it's fine, the king will come save us. Well, he thought that, but he also, picked up a book on basically how to war because he hadn't fought in a while. I think what's interesting about all the presidents is they're all ambitious. And in America, ambition is not a bad word, but Washington was all about gaining for a really long time. He wanted to gain in every area. He wanted to be the strongest. He wanted to be the richest. He wanted to be the most successful. And usually there is an insatiableness to that, right? The quality of hunger can be destructive. We've seen that with a lot of presidents. For example, Richard Nixon. Washington, what was fascinating about him, and one of the things that really drew me to him, in addition to the fact that he's hard to figure out, he could be satisfied. Turns out, while he is sort of hard to figure out, he's also quite simple. He's a man. And so he has sort of a basic set of expectations and of desires. He wanted to find a great partner. He wanted to restore Mount Vernon and expand it. He wanted to make great contributions to his country. He wanted power and respect. And when he got it, he was like, I'm good. I'm really, really good here. So what we see in his youth is a frustration with a lack of meritocracy when America and when Virginia, where he lives, is a colony.
And does that perceived unfairness and injustice, does that help him to get embroiled in the resistance to British rule then? Does that lead to him becoming a fairly leading figure in the American Revolution in a political sense as well as military?
I love this question because we think of revolutionaries as Che Guevara's, and that was not George Washington. That wasn't Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. These are men who owned plantations. They had businesses. They were trying to get ahead. And for a long time, they wrote what they called polite letters to the king, to parliament. They tried to make things work. And they would get ahead, and then something would happen and there would be a giant step back. So after, of course, this World War that George Washington started, Parliament needed to raise funds, and so there was taxation without representation. That was really frustrating to them. But what I love about George Washington's response to the Boston Tea Party, to the dumping of tea into the Boston Harbor because of charters that were exclusive to companies, that were of London. What I love about it is he writes, the coercive acts are really awful. You can't starve a colony. You can't, but they really shouldn't have destroyed property. He's a capitalist through and through. When he orders things from London purveyors. At first, he's so excited when he marries Martha because he gets to move up. It's sort of like he went from shopping at Target to suddenly shopping at Saks Fifth Avenue, if that tracks. I don't know what the lower edition would be, but maybe whatever your version of Target is, and then Harrods. He was suddenly like writing to Harrods, and his first letter to them is so triumphant. To the Carey Company, he writes, and he says, "I'm Martha's husband now, and I handle all her business." And he's just shopping away. But the problem is, by the time he gets those goods, which are ridiculous, he's ordering like purple velvet coaches. There's something wrong with them, and at the same time, he's also sending because we're an agrarian society, he's sending goods to London, like tobacco and other things that he has produced through enslaved labor, that he's, set in his mind a price. And then he gets a letter back and it says like, oh no, this was damaged or that wasn't quite up to par. And he's got absolutely no say. And then he tries to join, the local councils and to play a role in government as much as a colonist could. That doesn't work either. And so it's really over time that he becomes so frustrated that he feels like, okay, I have tried everything. When we write letters, when we pass local legislation, you dissolve us, you ignore us. When someone does respond alone, meaning a colony, because very wisely, Parliament kept the colonies isolated from each other. There was next to no interaction. People had often never met people from other colonies or even, corresponded. They had their own currency, which is something that constantly surprises people. But, if you had currency in Virginia, what were you going to do with it in Pennsylvania? Absolutely nothing. And so when he sees, okay, there's no way to get them peacefully to give us a fair shake, and if we act alone, they're going to come down really hard. So we've got to collaborate. And he's ready. And you have to remember that when the revolution started in earnest with Lexington and Concord, the Declaration of Independence, which he was already on his way to Lexington and Concord. He was on his way to Massachusetts. And so he didn't even sign the thing. Not that there would be room with John Hancock taking up so much, but he's on his way. And he's really, by the time it happens, he is wholly committed, to the point where he's chosen in part because he's one of the only people. He hasn't worn a uniform in a long time at this point. He's retired. He's even like sort of popping buttons on his old uniform. He's lived the good life with on Martha's, late husband's dime. There is concern that if America loses the war, which it very much should, the British are calling it a rebellion, not a revolution, which means they don't have to follow the rules of war. They have the most impressive navy in the world. And, America has like a boat and some pretty dubious funding. And so they're going around again at the Second Continental Congress saying, okay, who wants to lead this? A couple of people are like, I don't know. John Adams is like, I guess I'm a soldier now. And people say, no, please don't be a soldier. Please just go abroad and try and raise money. This is not going to win us the war. George Washington is one of the only people who has some military experience and also doesn't ask, if we lose and the British take my house and probably hang me, will you take care of my family? Will you give them that money back? He's ready to lose it all. And that's very impressive to people.
Yeah. I'm trying to get the image out of my head of George Washington as a kind of Julia Roberts shopping figure. He's in there with Richard Gere's credit cards, Martha's credit cards, saying, big mistake. So is that essentially how he becomes the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, that he is almost the only suitable candidate? He just happens to be in the right place at the right time with vaguely the right experience?
Absolutely. And I want to get back to that question, but I think I've never heard him compared to Julia Roberts.
I just had Pretty Woman playing in my head while you were talking then, and I can imagine him walking down the street, bags under his arms. Suddenly got all this money and he's buying everything he ever wanted.
I think it's actually quite good, and I'm sort of I'm chewing on it a bit because it works in the same way where he's not actually charging Martha for his services, but Martha is in a unique position in early America. She doesn't have to report to a man. She's known as a femme sole. She has complete control over her estate, which of course will eventually go to her 2-year-old and her 4-year-old. The 4-year-old Jackie is male, so it'll go to him. But he's 4, so she's in her mid-20s, so she has a lot of time ahead of her to enjoy life. She's getting kind of gross letters from local men saying, you have proven you can have children. I would like to have more with you. Let's do this. We think of Martha as this older lady in America. And I always say, don't be fooled by the bonnet. She's not a kindly grandmother. She's actually kind of mean. And back then, she's exceptionally good looking. She's buxom. She's got brown hair and big eyes, and she's petite. And, of course it helps, but her measurements are quite nice. Tiny little feet. And George Washington is also known, while a little bit thirsty for a rich wife, he's also known as being really good looking. He's graceful. He's an athlete. And so when he walks into her house, she notices him and she wants to keep him around. And things move very fast. He has to disentangle himself and sort of make, Governor Dinwiddie happy, because he has no idea the American Revolution is coming. He has to, he's a lowly subject. But that's something we don't know because they destroyed a lot of the letters. But we do know that from the point that they met to 6 months later when they marry, that things moved very fast and were probably pretty hot. They were 2 good-looking people who got together and kind of owned Virginia for a hot minute. They would go to all the balls. They had young children. They had all this money. He had prestige, even though he started this world war, which you would think would be a bad look. It was actually quite good because Dinwiddie had to spin it. And it was particularly a good look abroad, but also, within these cities among the elite, because George Washington's journal from that time was published. And for most people, it read like Huck Finn. I mean, it was a great adventure story because who wanted to go into the wilds of Ohio? I wouldn't have. And no one was quite good at it. Part of the reason the French did so poorly is they'd carry these giant mahogany beds and dressers around, which is a terrible idea if you go camping. That even the best and latest gear is still arduous. And so he's very much enjoying life, having a great time, living high on reputation and Martha's dime, and pretty into her. Now, as I've already said, he had stepchildren, but not children of his own. And sometimes people blame Martha for that with absolutely no evidence. They'll say, well, childbirth sometimes, that leaves women unable to have additional children if it was rough. There's absolutely nothing to suggest that she had a tough time having children. She had 2, and it seems like she could have more. George Washington, however, no actual DNA link has emerged in the last 250 years where it has for Madison and other people. Sometimes they'll, of course, Thomas Jefferson, and sometimes the families, the descendants will try and deny access so that there isn't DNA testing. But there has been with Washington, and while his brothers and Jackie and his grandson Washi, his namesake, certainly raped enslaved women, there is no descendant of George Washington's. And so it is very safe to say that the one time he left America, when he went to Barbados and he got very sick, that he probably lost the ability to procreate, to have children. He still, from what we understand, liked procreative sex. He always wanted to have Martha around. He just wasn't procreating.
And I guess maybe later in his story, the fact that he doesn't have biological children of his own maybe impacts his view of what his legacy will be. It won't be a physical legacy. So where else can he leave a mark? And perhaps when we get to his setting down of power, is that driven because he doesn't have a dynastic element to anything that he's doing? I'm not sure.
Well, it's interesting. In early America, it just wasn't a big deal if your children were not your biological children. We see this with several founders and presidents in the early republic. James Madison, for example, had no biological children, but he raised Dolly Madison's as his own. And Washington very much felt like Jackie was his son, and then he felt like Washi was his son. And they had 2 small children with him when they were president. When I say they were, but when Martha joined Washington in New York, the first site of the president's house, and later Philadelphia, as they were building D.C., the whole nation knew that he had 2 small children. There was never this stepchildren, it was just his children. And so our sort of understanding of biological connections and adoption, it's very different than their conception of it. I wish I could assign Washington such wonderful, attributes and to give him that sort of forethought. But he really just left the presidency after 2 terms because he never wanted it in the first place. He had proven everything he had to prove in this little thing called the American Revolution. And he never wanted to go back into power. And he certainly didn't feel like he was a politician. He hadn't studied it. He hadn't been to college. He wanted to restore Mount Vernon, which had fallen into disrepair. But it was hard for him to watch America struggled to repay debts. There was a sort of divorce settlement, if you will, with the British, and there were monies owed, and all sorts of issues were happening. The Articles of Confederation were a mess. And so he finally deigned to go to the Constitutional Convention and preside over it as the president, thinking, okay, one final thing. And Martha doesn't even want to go. And he tells everyone she's not going. The wives usually go and live it up because this happens in like a fun city. And she doesn't want to go. She's done. She's been traveling. She does not like to leave Virginia. She didn't want to get inoculated. George Washington was very into inoculations. He 100% would have, pushed. He would have done Pfizer, ads during COVID, no doubt. But he presides over and he thinks, okay, I'm done. But everyone is looking at him thinking, oh, we have so much to decide right now. Let's just be as general as possible about the presidency, because obviously he's going to be president and he'll figure it out. We can trust him. Who gives up power and then decides, no, I'm going to be a tyrant. And then they write to him, they sort of harass him. James Madison shows up at Christmas, won't leave his house until he's like, fine, I'll be president. And he calls the procession to New York to be inaugurated. He calls it, he describes it as, the road to my execution, which shows you how stoked he was for that. He didn't want to be there. And then it was exhausting. He didn't like being criticized. He was very sensitive to criticism. He inadvertently gave rise to partisanship. He felt old. He liked to talk about being old, but he wasn't really. A couple of years later, of course, there was the threat of war, and John Adams said, can you step in and maybe lead the army if we need you to again? And he's like, fine. He's 64 at that point, which is in the geriatric jamboree that has become American politics is like a young gun. But he wanted to go home, and he loved to talk about being old, not only at that point, but even when he was younger. He was always just like, I'm such an old man. And it's like, you're 35.
I'm conscious we're giving away lots of spoilers about him becoming president, which I'm sure everybody is perfectly well aware of.
Don't tell.
Yeah, don't give away the ending. But is the reason that everyone is so keen for him to be president because he's been this figurehead in the war, so you can almost credit him with winning the war? How much of the winning he's actually done personally, I guess, doesn't matter so much as the fact that he's the man in charge. And then his willingness, in complete contradiction to the English system and to everybody else in Europe at the time, he just puts everything down and walks away, which must have seemed quite astonishing that he would turn his back on so much power and authority. Is it that makes them think this is a guy we need in charge of the country because he doesn't want it?
In part, yes. It's difficult. It's very tempting, after the insurrection, after January 6th, to say, well, King George at the time allegedly said he was the greatest man who ever lived if he gave up power. But he wasn't Napoleon. He wasn't supposed to be Napoleon. Napoleon actually always complained that people expected him to be Washington. He was supposed to be more of like a prime minister in that role. And prime ministers, well, they were colluding for sure, but they did eventually leave. They were not supposed to die in office. It was not supposed to be hereditary. For Washington to give up power, though, after such a remarkable feat, was so impressive to the world. He was by far the most famous person, and he got a lot of perks. He wasn't, I wouldn't quite call him an influencer, but he was not against using his fame. My favorite story is that, it's an agrarian society, but he just decides that mules are the future. But you can't get get a mule, you have to have a horse and a donkey. And we don't have that in America yet. The Spanish do, though, but it's illegal. It's illegal to get one of those here. You have to get some sort of special commission for the crown. So he starts just like basically asking for a free ride. And eventually it does get to the king. He's like, oh, of course we'll send two. And he sends one, makes it. Unfortunately, the other one perishes. Rest in peace. But royal gift comes. And at first he doesn't deign to mate with these lowly American horses. But then Washington figured out that he liked to watch other animals have sex, and then was so inspired. But he was so proud of that, and he would put out all these ads. Who wants royal gift? Which also I love to say he charged for. It wasn't free. He was like, I'm forever a capitalist. I might be the father of this country, but I'm forever a capitalist. And so he was an interesting contradiction. But I think the feat itself was remarkable. It gets complicated, though, right? I don't want to deny him any credit, but in my book, I wanted to make this point so clearly that I made a chart of it, which is, it's mentioned, always in a text that the British ran through generals. But it's something when you look year by year at the revolution, which went on for 8 long years, and you see on the American side, George Washington, George Washington, George Washington, you know, all the way 8 years through. And then you see a bunch of different names. And that makes a big difference. The stability that he always brought from the very beginning throughout the war was a part of this story. It wasn't just giving up power. It was being a dude you could count on.
Yeah, always being there when you need him.
Yes.
Are there any really key achievements of Washington's 2 terms as president? So does he do anything really striking as America's first president, or is it all really about building the systems and the institutions and the structures of government that will serve America for decades to follow?
I mean, some of it is setting up shop, right? It's organizing, it's systems. He invents the cabinet out of frustration. He goes to talk to Congress. We're not supposed to have any sort of cabinet because of Parliament, still a dirty word in America. But he's very frustrated. The one time he goes to Congress for their opinion, he's got to negotiate a new treaty with the Creeks. He wants to know what's going on. He sends them questions ahead of time. He thinks it'll be like the Council of War that he used during the Revolution. He gets there and they are... Well, one, they're like, oh my God, it's George Washington. And they're so excited. A lot of them hadn't seen him in person. And so they are a little flummoxed. Then they say, oh, we need to discuss this. We have to break up into groups. Because they're also new at being in Congress and governing at this level. And so that's a time we see George Washington lose his cool. He leaves Congress and he says he's never coming back. And he doesn't, but he sort of yells it. And instead invents the cabinet. Other precedents, he signs various bills, including the first law that allows the owners of enslaved people to go after them if they have run away, which he himself does while in office. He also decides it's probably a good idea to get a navy. And so he does that. And he comes up with various policies that do set America up. For example, the revolution kept going in a lot of ways. Not only did it inspire revolutions like the French Revolution, which was far bloodier, but it also kept causing problems between the various world powers. And he decided, well, I know you helped us out, but we're not going to do that because we are a young country. We've got to be stable. And so we are going to stay out of everyone's business. And that's something actually that he had come up with during the revolution. It was really important. It's not a potato thing that the British government would not call it a revolution. And he insisted on calling it a revolution. Those rules of war, it was about brutality for sure. The Hessians went around and sort of turned almost everyone against them. Even loyalists by the end just wanted them gone. But it was also about projecting an image to the rest of the world. Look, we're in the throes of a revolution. We have never governed ourselves. We haven't worked together in any sort of capacity before this. But look at us. We're stable. We have law and order. We're trying to trade. We've got people getting loans abroad. You can trust us. And so he sets that up, and that's something that he continues. I really do think that his greatest contribution throughout his entire life to America was, with that exception of that World War, the French and Indian War, or as you call it, the 7 Years' War. It really was his projection and his insistence on stability at all times.
Yeah, which I guess reflects his career throughout the whole period. As you mentioned, he's been the general in charge of the American forces while all of that change has been going on in the English forces. And maybe then he's learned the importance of that stability and of projecting continuity and certainty which he's able to take into his presidency, which I guess might make it slightly surprising that he then decides to step down after 2 terms when presumably he could have carried on for as long as he'd wanted to almost.
He didn't want to die in office. He feared that would set a bad precedent, that people would just continue to serve every 4 years, and that this idea of power would become the most important motivating force to be president and to maintain it. His greatest concern about political parties, he tells us in his farewell address. So he printed his, goodbye, and he wrote it to friends as he addressed it. And it was read aloud in pubs, the same places where they read the partisan newspapers that hurt him so deeply. He didn't really think, you should have term limits. That didn't come until FDR ran for a 3rd and then a 4th, and he died in office. Washington felt like the problem with political parties and serving so many terms and growing old in office is you risk elected officials shifting their alliances from the people they're supposed to be serving, which at the time were just landowning white men, to their political party. And all of their efforts then going to maintaining power. And if they do that, he felt, and he used this word, it's a natural slide into despotism, what other people would call dictators. And that is what we've seen throughout the world. And so he was right about that. He didn't like being president. He felt really sensitive. It was exhausting. Martha hated it. It wasn't a part of their deal. She herself felt her age a little bit more than him. She wrote in this kind of heartbreaking letter, and it's often hard to feel bad for her because she's a jerk and she's not very nice. But she writes in this heartbreaking letter that she felt as if the role was better suited for a younger woman.
Yeah,
she just wanted to retire.
Just had enough.
It gets kind of sad at the end.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's true as well, going back to your point and what we've been talking about how stability and a healthy relationship with power, that those are complementary qualities. But there's a reality to Washington that is not true about Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or Monroe or certainly not John Adams. And it's interesting because the first time anyone said it to my face was a John Adams scholar in Boston. She said, she asked me, I don't mean to be rude, but do you ever get bored because Washington's so vanilla? And it's true. His letters aren't as interesting as the rest. He doesn't have any weird things in his, closet. He is pretty much an open book, and that book is fine. It's really what you expect. He's wildly consistent, if that can be 2 words that go together. And in the end, the balls, the trappings of the president, the different gifts, the visits from various dignitaries, it was fun, but he could do it a few times and be totally fine with it because he just wanted the same meal, the same bed, the same property.
It sounds like he was sort of excitingly boring in that that's what America needed after you've just had a revolution. What you need is a nice level-headed guy who's really not interested in all of this rubbish to just let it all settle around him. He could have gone wild and he could have called himself King George and he could have set all kinds of crazy precedents. But because you get this guy who doesn't really want it, isn't massively impressed with it, and is bored already, that's actually quite good for a new country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another way of describing it, though, is that he was a bit of a control freak. So he liked to be general because everyone had to do what you said. And remember that the first role he had, the first title, the one he had longest throughout his entire life, was master. He was the master to hundreds of enslaved people who most certainly could not challenge him. There's one really harrowing incident in which a enslaved man can't move a log by himself because logs are really heavy, but Washington is impatient and he slaps him. That's, how Washington felt about anyone talking back. And the presidency was just wild in that way for him. There were too many people talking and doing their own thing and challenging him, and there were machinations, and there was power struggles, and there were all sorts of things, and he was just like, oh, this is not my scene.
Does he deserve his legacy? You know, he's considered the father of the American nation and perhaps one of the greatest figures in all of American history. Does he deserve that, or is he overrated? Is he overhyped?
I don't think he's overhyped. I don't think he's overrated, but I don't think we see him as clearly as we should. Having spent now many years with him, I feel like I know him quite well. Washington was... I am often the recipient of two ends of the spectrum in America. There are people, and particularly during the summer of George Floyd, during the pandemic, when there were lots of protests against police brutality, and we had a president who inspired greater divisions within the country, there were these moments in which I would be sort of confronted by both sides at once. You know, the more conservative, whiter pools would say, well, he was a man of his time. You know, he was great and we should celebrate him. There was a real emphasis on that word. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there would be people who would say, he enslaved people. I don't want to know anything about him. And I would say you're both kind of concerned, you don't realize it, but about the same thing. So if he enslaved people, if you have all sorts of problems with him, you don't think that has to do with the present? Why? I wouldn't go into I hope I don't ever go into a gunfight, but I wouldn't go into one with like a dull kitchen knife. I would go in with a gun. And so if you want to fight against George Washington and entrenched values that we still see in our hierarchical and racist, tendencies within our communities and our infrastructures, then you need to know that history. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I always say, this panic around cancel culture and canceling George Washington. You want to cancel George Washington? Best of luck. How do you even do that? You'd have to get powers from witches or something and make the whole country lose their memories. George Washington is as American as America. You cannot separate those two entities. At the same time, I just don't think of his complexity as a liability. And I think if you do, that might suggest you have some personal work to do. We are the heirs of the founders, but they never expected to be our fathers. I always like to say when people call them the founding fathers, I really disliked it for a long time, and now I lean into it. It's all useful as far as getting people to think critically. But they're not your real dads. You have different fathers. They were just the first. And they were not superhuman. They couldn't predict the future. They actually would be pretty disappointed in us, not for, integration, giving women the right to vote. They'd be mad that we don't have more amendments, that we didn't make more changes, that we don't view discourse and debate as healthy and conduct it in an authentic manner. Those are the things that they would find difficult. One of the most important points that people forget constantly when they say he was a man of his time. Well, sure, but you're telling on yourself when you say that, because you know who else was a man of their time? The enslaved man Washington slapped for not moving a log on his own. The Marquis de Lafayette was a man of his time, and he spent decades writing to Washington, begging him to free his enslaved population because it would set a precedent in America. And the women who ran salons in Philadelphia, there was a woman named Mrs. Powell who Washington often went to for advice and her thoughts. You could define her in those terms, as we always say, congressman, all of these things. She was a man of his time. And so he's a man of his time, and he's well aware of the other men of his time. He's in conversation with them. This is just how he feels about things. And so we have to take people at their words. And he was very clear about how he felt about literally everything. He's not trying to hide anything.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted to end on, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I feel like I could keep going and going and going, and this would be the most epic episode ever, because he's just such an interesting man with so many facets to his story and his character and everything about him.
I agree.
Yeah. And obviously everyone can go read your book, and then they won't have to listen to any more of me waffling on about Washington. I wanted to end on a question that kind of reflects, we're in a world of Assassin's Creed where players of the game are witnessing various of these important moments happening in front of them and meeting George Washington and things like that. If you had that technology like the Animus, you could go back in time. If you could step into a moment in George Washington's life and witness something, when would that moment be and why?
What a good question. Do I have to pick just one?
No.
We know it sounds, it's hard because I'm one of the few women presidential historians in America. There just simply aren't that many. I'm the first woman historian in over 100 years to write a biography of George Washington. And so I'm aware of that position. And so the first answer I'm going to give, I'm sort of afraid to say it because it makes it seem like, oh, of course she feels this way. But it's the time we know the least amount. We know about every other period of his life. We know about every other relationship. But the one we don't know is about his courtship with Martha. And I want to know, what were those early conversations like? When did they get engaged? Did they talk about how their life would be? Did they talk about, the role he wanted to play in the colony? Did they have aspirations for the future? Did he want to, eventually become some iteration of Governor Dinwiddie? Those are the things that I would really like to know. And other than that, I think I'd love to see him that first winter at Valley Forge. Everything is going poorly. The soldiers are untrained. They're volunteers, which he hates because what's the motivation? Again, he's a capitalist. He likes money. And all these people are trying to take his power. The Congress sends delegates to see him to, I think they talk about beating him over the head because he's asking for money, he's asking for training, he's asking for more time, all of these things. And he somehow turns it all around. There's a delegate named Dana, and he talks about this moment where he realizes, oh, this guy's right. And he came adamant that George Washington was not the right man for the job, certainly not the only man for the job. And he leaves completely won over. Washington was not a charmer. Whatever he did, whatever he showed them during this time was so remarkable that no one in that group questioned his authority again. The cabals died. He was revered. He was protected and evaded capture after Benedict Arnold betrayed him. That, to me, is something that I've never felt like I have the clearest picture of, and I would love it. But I wouldn't want to be there because he would say, what are you doing here? You're a tiny woman.
I feel like I need to go and watch Pretty Woman again, because when you're talking about his early courtship with Martha, I'm thinking, well, obviously he's telling her how long his inner thigh is and wrapping it around her in a bath. That's what happened. No,
I want to see it too.
It's clear in my mind, and probably an image I'll never get rid of. But thank you so much for joining us, Alexis. It's been absolutely fascinating to try and get under the skin of this most incredible of figures in American history. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking on the link in the description. And maybe click one of the links somewhere on the screen. You know you want to. They're here somewhere.